Hi all, welcome to Kalkona Cricket Cast. I'm your host, Pratham, and I'm glad today to be joined by a fellow friend and somebody who had regard as a cricket Australia expert from the other side of the shores, but he's actually there to see the final this time around and has traveled across I don't know if you could say seven seas, but quite a bit. Um, Sanket. And so, yeah, um, glad to have him on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here once again. I think I remember the last time we did this. We did this was again before a WTC final, and that was in 2023. And again, that time around, also I
Yep.
was like it was I think the day before I traveled to England, and this time around I'm already here. And yeah, we are starting tomorrow with the test match. I don't know if this recording will be out by then, but yeah, hopefully it's still relevant by the time we release.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and again, we're always appreciative of you taking that extra step and actually going and seeing it live. I know last time your reaction was pretty pleasant, given the team that ended up winning. Uh, but no, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, mate. But yeah, so we're back at it again. We're talking about the WTC final, one of the events I regard as probably one of the most significant, if not the most significant, in all of cricket. Even though it's not had a very long history, it's left a indelible impact on everybody who loves Test cricket in particular. So I'm glad to have you on. But yeah, we're here to talk about the WTC final, and this time around, Australia's also made it, like the last time around when Australia was playing against India. Um, but the difference is that this time around, India didn't qualify, and in their place comes in South Africa. Um, so quite an interesting set of turn of events. India probably would have actually anticipated to make it this time, but the home series whitewash, which was completely out of the blue to New Zealand by most you know observers, and then that allied with their unfortunate showing in Australia, being drubbed in the fashion that they did. 3-1 meant that South Africa ended up qualifying, having defeated at home Pakistan and then Sri Lanka. Um, and actually, that's probably the best topic to kind of just sort of start digging into the details about, because with the WTC format, right? I mean, it's a bunch of test series, and there's an attempt to try to provide context to them. And so, when you're providing context, you're looking at basically your performance accumulated across 2 years, and seeing the results um, are based off your essentially your win percentages and your the number of points that you're getting and so forth, and that's what's really qualifying you for this spot both at the final. um, and there's been controversy over this, right? Even in the very first round when India and New Zealand were facing at it back in, I believe they played in Southampton, the Rose Bowl, the final here in England that time around. There was some controversy over whether did did they actually, New Zealand deserve it because they had um, a lot of series at home. They didn't really play that much away. They had a series in Sri Lanka, which I believe they drew back then, in that 2019 to 21 cycle. But the question I want to actually ask you first, is, Sanket, do you feel like these two teams, given the schedule, um, deserved to be in the final? Do you feel like either team had the luck of the gab, so to speak, that was excessive? What are your thoughts?
So I think you've touched upon a very important topic in this whole WTC debate, and I think we've gone through now the third edition of the WTC, and you had the first edition where you had one set of rules. Although the problem was with that edition, it was marred a little bit by COVID, so you had quite a few series that were cancelled, and maybe if all those series had been played, then you might not have got the final that you did end up getting. So that was there. Then they ended up changing the rules for the second edition, in which they based it on the percentage of test matches played rather than, based on the percentage of series. So earlier, what used to happen in the first edition was that each series had an equal number of points. So whether it's a two test series or a five test series, it had like a maximum of 120 points. And then the points per test were divided based on the number of tests that are there in the series. So if it is a two test series, you would have 60 points per test, whereas for a five test series you would have only 24. So that was a bit controversial, and then they changed the rules to base it on the number of test matches played in totality. But I think the problem with the current rule is that it doesn't really quantify the quality of the opposition you've played. So if you're playing five tests, generally the big three, like Australia, England, India, they all are playing five tests against each other now. So when you play five tests against the top teams, and then when you play against a weaker side and you end up playing only two test matches, so the opportunity for you to really increase your points is limited, because you're always playing against each other. Majority of your test matches, wherein you have very limited scope, and almost invariably, the two of the big three are playing like two series against each other in a cycle because of the way the structure is. So you almost end up playing 10 tests against a top quality opposition, which is what happened with both India and Australia in this cycle. In fact, England as well. So they all ended up playing two series against each other in this particular cycle. So you played 10 tests out of maybe total of 16, 17, 18 against these sides. And then in the other series, you're playing only two test matches. England are a little bit better in that regard. They've played other sides as well. They played three tests against West Indies, three tests against Sri Lanka. But with regards to India, okay, they did play in three against New Zealand. They were ended up losing that. That came out of the blue. But in general, if you compare it with a team like South Africa, uh, they look at their schedule. They played two tests against Pakistan. They did two tests against Sri Lanka at home, and all their away series were also in favorable conditions. They played against West Indies, they played against Bangladesh, and yeah, I think the other series was against New Zealand, which again has historically been a favorable matchup for them, but because of the kind of squad that they sent for that series, they ended up losing that 2-0. And they still, because of how easy the rest of the schedule was, they could actually afford to do that and still get away with it, which is, I think, one of the great ironies of this WTC, in the sense that the format was introduced in a way to add value to test cricket, to increase the viewership and the attention of the rest of the world, because the big three have always valued test cricket. The series among these three against each other do not need a WTC tag or anything like that. So they have big enough narratives among themselves that the larger picture of the WTC doesn't really matter in the scheme of things. But when you're playing against other sides, or when the other, like, two smaller nations are playing against each other, that is when WTC was supposed to incentivize teams to prioritize Test cricket. But what we've seen with South Africa is that they sent an absolute joke of a squad to New Zealand because of a clash with their domestic T20 tournament. And
Yep.
I think that was probably, I think, the most glaring example of a blatant disrespect or blatant disregard for Test cricket that we've seen. And that is the team that has ended up reaching the final purely because of this scheduling quirks. So I think there is a lot of irony in that. So I don't think, has the WTC achieved its objective of spreading the game far and wide. I think clearly not, based on I think we've just seen the irony of the retirements that have been announced in the last couple of weeks. Even though Heinrich Klaassen was not a part of the Test side, but he's retired from international cricket while he's still very much in his prime, even if not at his absolute peak. Still good enough to go for another couple of years with a home World Cup on the horizon, with a T20 World Cup in India, where he is so admired in the horizon next year. He's chosen to part ways with international cricket. You had Nicholas Buran, again, not particularly relevant to Test cricket because he's never played one,
Yeah.
but again, retiring from international cricket just to extend his career in the domestic leagues all around. So uh, I think, despite all the measures that you know the ICC has taken, or they pretend to have taken, or they believe that they've taken, uh, it's not quite worked out, because I think ultimately the economics tell, and the financially it is not feasible for a lot of these players to maybe focus on the longer format of the game from outside of the big three nations. So. Uh, yeah, I mean, in that sense, I wouldn't say that the WTC has been, a great success. Yeah, I mean, I do like watching it. I have myself come for the last two finals myself all the way. But if you ask me whether it has achieved the larger objective of what it was set out to achieve, I wouldn't say so. And that therein lies the greatest irony. And South Africa, if they do end up winning this one, and if having done so after you know having sent that kind of squad to New Zealand, then I think it will just reinforce more than anything else. I think the flaws in the scheduling and the point system, wherein uh, I would say personally that the earlier system was better, wherein you at least had equal number of points per series. So again, while a team winning a series 5-0 does get the same points as a team winning the series 2-0, which is a little bit unfair in that sense. But at least there is an equivalency in the opposition, and that you're not being penalized for playing against the top sides more, which is what is happening in this particular case, wherein you're encouraged to play longer series against weaker teams, and maybe not as much against the stronger teams. But again, teams would continue to play against oppositions which bring them profit. Like Australia, England, India are not going to play two test match series against each other just to qualify for the WTC final. They know that five tests bring in the money, and that is why the series have grown. Like, other than the Ashes, the other two series in this combination, they've grown from four tests to five tests over the last 5 years or so, purely because of the value that it was bringing in monetarily to the boats. So yeah, I mean, so ultimately, I don't think those particular series need a WTC narrative. And as far as the rest are concerned, well, I think so far it hasn't worked. So they might have to look at other measures. Or there has been a talk of a test match fund and things like that. So yeah, I think ICC would have to consider those measures very seriously.
No, I think you bring up some really good, fair points. I'm a little bit more optimistic in terms of the overall series, the overall role of the WTC. I know that in terms of just encouraging a little bit more viewership and a little bit more context from outside, what are collectively known as the Big Three nations. There's definitely been, from anecdotally, from what I can tell, and also just from some other examples, a little bit more interest stimulated around different series because of the lead up to the qualification process and so forth. So I think that in that respect, the just from a fan engagement perspective across the board, there's been a little bit more of an increase. Obviously, with the schedule, it's been kind of tricky. I tend to agree with your sentiments in particular. That squad that was sent to New Zealand, even though I do feel there were some talented players in that setup and so forth, I do feel that that was it was very. I mean, it was very unfortunate that transpired in the way that it did, right? And I, you know, without any spoilers, right? New Zealand ended up defeating them in the end. That squad fairly comfortably. Although the South Africans did give a fight in that second test for a little bit till the fourth innings or so, when Kane Williamson kind of roped home pretty comfortably, or took his side pretty comfortably. But yeah, I do think that there are some gripes with the scoring system, and actually in particular, one of my other bigger gripes, apart from like what you mentioned, where the series you do get penalized for playing in stronger oppositions for longer periods of time. I think there's the other context of you don't necessarily get points for winning a series, and I think part of what you're seeing in terms of the decline of the draw. I know that's one of kind of the pushes of this format to try to make it more result oriented, but I do think that might have gone a little bit overboard. I think that there is actually a lot of value in going for drawn series, especially when you're in a situation where you're trying to hold off, or you can't necessarily enforce the win outright. So I think that there is that is a bit of a a drawback that um, there's almost been there was a period of time, right, in the early and mid 2000s in particular, where there was a increase in a lot of drawn matches, largely due to the state of the pitches, but also due to some of the gameplay and so forth. Um, and we might have gone in the opposite direction a little bit too much because of this incentivization of the individual test match over the overall series, in terms of uh, winning that or drawing that, as opposed to winning a bunch of matches in the series but losing some as well. So I mean, I have my gripes as well. I do think though, given yes, South Africa has had a relatively speaking easier schedule. I do think that they still have had some sufficient challenges during the cycle, because that the Sri Lanka team that played them at home was not a particularly, I would say, a poor team. It was on the up, by and large, and I do think that even with like even with that loss, that with that substandard squad that they sent to New Zealand, they still had to play India at home, right? They still had to deal with the West Indies abroad, which yes might not have been the strongest test team going around at the moment, but had a decent bowling attack in conditions that were conducive to them. So I do think they still had enough of a challenge posited to them where they sort of deserved that spot, having gone through with the process. But definitely, scheduling is something that they have to look at, and providing more context. Actually, speaking of which, one of the things I actually really liked about this time, the WTC final, and that would help, in addition to the discussion that you're mentioning of in general having later of the test match fun, is the idea that the prize money this time around for the winners of the tournament has been doubled. And so I think last time around it was about a 1.6 million, and now it's 3.6 million. Uh, you know, in terms of that regard, and then the runners up them also are going to be getting a significantly more amount. I think about 2 million and so forth, right? And again, it's a small drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things in terms of the commercial aspect, but at least it's a good gesture to indicate that the ICC and in general there is some value for this event that is increasing as the tournament goes on. But yeah, that's a just a broader discussion, right, about the WTC format as a large. Let's kind of focus a little bit more closer into the specifics of this particular event. And so we know that first time around it was in Southampton, at the Rose Bowl, and that produced a pretty exciting contest that went to the last day. Pretty pretty, I would say, even keel. Even though New Zealand ended up winning in the end by a decent margin, there was a fairly well contested match between India and New Zealand on a pitch that pretty much offered a decent amount both sides in terms of bowlers and batsmen and so forth. It was a little bit tricky to bat on, but both bowlers from both sides could capitalize. I felt had if they bowled well in the right areas and they bowled accordingly, and there was some seam available, and there was even some spin later on that surface. Um, and then the last final that took place between India and Australia, that also had some had an interesting pitch that started out green. That was at the oval, and then flattened out, and then by the end started the variable bounce started taking shape a little bit more on a surface that was fairly hard and firm, but by and large. Uh, this time around, we're playing at what many people consider the home of cricket, colloquially, so to speak, Lords. And so that's where actually my, you know, interest lies in, right? In terms of how exactly, do you feel it was the right call to play at Lords? And as for that matter, do you feel it was the right call to even play in England? Because some of the controversy that's been arising is that every time teams have to go travel to England, now as a just a matter of the state of the teams, that England have put out in recent years, they haven't been competitive enough to really qualify for the WTC final, so it's not really necessarily been a home advantage for either side that has actually ended up playing. But is it been reasonable to host this final event in England, of all places? And do you feel that the venue chosen this time, Lords, is the right choice on their end? Because obviously there are other grounds in England that have been used in the past and that could have potentially been used here too, with the contingents in mind. So what are your thoughts about that, Sanket?
So yeah, I mean, just based on that, again, that is another topic that has stirred up a lot of debate and a lot of strong opinions from fans, particularly Indian fans, who tend to cry foul about the WTC always being in England. And you know obviously, I think whenever you point out about the extremely unfair advantages that India as a cricket team have enjoyed, most notably being in the recent Champions Trophy, which was reduced to a bit of a farce due to the scheduling, even though obviously there are reasons for it, and obviously they couldn't play in Pakistan for obvious reasons. But still, I think the manner in which the whole tournament was handled, and seeing the ICC chairperson, celebrating the trophy with the Indian cricket team, I think that was, for me, that did not leave a good taste in the mouth, and it was a bit of a farce. So whenever you point out the facts about the unfair perks that Indian cricketers have been enjoying for quite some time now from the ICC, there is always this question of the WTC and why it is always in England, and why not elsewhere. So I think firstly it's only the third edition, and it's gone a bit like the Cricket World Cup, the 50 over World Cup as well,
Yep.
wherein you had the first three editions being hosted in England, and then the fourth one was in the subcontinent in India and Pakistan. So I don't think they've announced the venue for the 2027 edition yet, but I think the biggest challenge here is logistics because of the cycles in which the WTC runs. So it is from July to March. So then you have April, May, which is like tacitly accepted as an IPL window, wherein you don't even though it is not officially recognized as one, but by and large, teams avoid scheduling international matches there because if you do schedule, then I think you already ended up seeing the consequences of that with some of the early retirements, and those are from players who are actually already playing the IPL, and then they've still chosen to retire because they wanted to play other leagues as well, in which some of these IPL franchises do have significant amount of stakes as well. So it is an unfortunate reality of the modern game, but yeah. So just coming back to your point, so unless and until you can just change the WTC cycle, and basically the change would have to happen every 2 years because if you want to keep changing venues, then the cycle would also keep shifting, and then it would end up messing up the scheduling. Or maybe you could do one thing is that the cycle ends in March, but you still end up playing the final in October, November, or whenever. Like if you're holding it in India, for example, or in Australia, or in any other country, you can probably just hold it at a time when the cricketing season runs in those particular countries, but by that time the next cycle would have already started, so it would be a little bit of a contradiction in the sense that you already have the second cycle of the WTC running, and the final of the previous cycle is not yet completed. So that for
Yeah.
me is the biggest contradiction. Otherwise, I do not see any problems with that aspect. But if they do want, like the WTC to come to a natural conclusion with the final being the last test of a particular cycle, then it would have to happen in June. And if it happens in June or max to max by July, then there are very very few options left as far as countries that could potentially host these matches. So I think the only other country that hosts test matches uh, during this particular time is the West Indies, and
Yep.
West Indies is not. Let's be very honest about it. It's not a country that is renowned for attracting crowds to test matches, to say the least. It is a place where you know you probably get the least amount of attention for test cricket. Sri Lanka again has hosted tests in July, August. I don't remember any in June recently. I'm not quite sure what the weather is over there. Pakistan is ruled out, I think, for obvious reasons. India will obviously never travel there. So you're left with very limited options, to be very honest. And England is the only country which can attract good crowds even for neutral test matches. Like, this is the third edition, and England has not qualified for a single of them, and yet you've had crowds being packed. Obviously, the first edition was played under COVID, so you had a very limited number of tickets being sold. But Australia, India, 2023, I was there. It was a house full all 4 days, all 5 days. The stadiums were packed, and again this time around, you have the tickets have been sold out way ahead of time, and people had to resort to purchasing tickets through third party apps, or in the black market, basically, so to speak, just to get tickets. So even though there is no India, there's no Pakistan. So these are the two countries with the largest diaspora of population in the UK. Neither of these teams have made the final, nor have the home team, England. So you have two countries, Australia and South Africa. Australia obviously do have that rivalry with England with the Ashes. So there is a significant amount of interest for Australia and England as well. But still, just to get uh, all 5 days, all 4 days rather, sold out so far in advance does go to show the amount of regard there is for Test cricket in England as compared to other countries. Like, I do not expect this Test would have sold out in India, for example. India would probably do sell out Test matches involving the home side, but even though India is not regarded as a Test loving nation, but as that seems to have changed over the last few years. Under Virat Kohli's captaincy, there has been an increase in the attention and increase in interest in Test cricket, even among the so-called casual viewer. But whether that continues after his retirement and after the retirement of a large chunk of this golden generation of cricketers, that remains to be seen. But even so, I just think purely based on the passion that Indians have for cricket, India would probably still manage to sell out a Test match final involving India. But whether it would sell out a neutral Test like an England would, absolutely not. Australia, again, I'm not very sure about that. Australia have never hosted a neutral Test match, as far as I'm aware. So Australia again would definitely sell out Test matches involving Australia, but whether they would be on par with England for a neutral match, I'm not quite so sure. And again, because of the scheduling, I think just everything comes boils down to the scheduling. England just becomes a very, very convenient location for the final. And whether Lords is the right venue or not, well, I think the first edition was actually supposed to be held at Lords. It was then postponed for COVID. Like, it was shifted for COVID reasons, because I think apparently, if I remember correctly, there were stricter lockdowns in London than there were maybe elsewhere. Then this 2023 final was shifted to the Oval. So now you finally have it, like the third final, which is being played in the home of cricket, and I think that that's fair, because it is the venue with the maximum amount of history and tradition, and you always get good crowds for Test matches at Lords. You do have a significant amount of the MCC members and the general London population, which is highly interested in Test cricket, irrespective of who is playing. So I think it is definitely the right choice. Now, whether should every final be held there, like I said, then it again comes down to whether you believe every final should be held in England or not, or whether they can possibly find a way to shift the cycle every 2 years, or change the scheduling in a manner. Look, I don't really have any strong opinions on that, but right now I don't think there can be any complaints about England hosting the final. Man, in a way, it is good that England have not made any of these three finals. So you've had three proper neutral test matches to gauge what England as a country offers to neutral test matches. And then maybe if you were to hold the final, the fourth final, for example, the 2027 final in another country, then you at least have some sort of barometer for comparison, where you have three neutral test matches in England and then maybe a neutral test somewhere else. And then if you just compare the two, and if you feel that others are not living up to the expectation, then I think you can just go back to England, because ultimately you have to make money.
No, I think they're all, you bring up some really good sort of points regarding in particular with the scheduling, and in particular, the other aspect I could also consider is weather, right? Some periods would be infeasible to host a final like this, just because of the monsoon season. Now, as it turns out, in England too, there's rain. There's rain pretty consistently, as you might have been able to tell with the trips and so forth. But usually, this time of the year, it's not terrible in that respect. You can still get days of play, even if you get a day or two that is washed out. Um, I think in Sri Lanka in particular, you'll find that issue. I know that in Sri Lanka there was the Australian Pakistan test that was hosted as a neutral. There was a series that was hosted, a couple of games way back in 2002, and the crowds for that weren't the best, admittedly. So I think that is part of what may influence those kind of decisions as well. Um, I do think that the Cricket West Indies board, there has been some better financial results of late, coming out there, and I know you mentioned regarding the crowds for Test cricket in a current context not being all that hot, but I having seen some of the test matches happen, especially at the smaller venues, England versus West Indies, when they played, I think in not in Barbados, but in, I think it was Grenada, the or trying to remember the exact island, but it was the third test, and they were playing, um, you know, I think it was Dominica actually. It was a new venue, but um, there was a good turnout and so forth, and in that vein, and I do feel that it the West Indies may be an interesting possibility to consider. But yes, I think from a purely a perspective of attracting crowds at the moment, um, you can't really do much better than England in terms of I would say, especially in terms of the neutral diaspora. Right? I mean the diaspora from different countries, right? Because England is has just got a lot of different groups, like ethnicities, particularly London, right? I would say the two venues that would fit this being the one that we played last time in the final, um, the Oval, and and as well as Lords, right? um, you've got London's a very diverse, multicultural place, and even there's just a lot of people as part of a diaspora from different backgrounds. There's even I would say a South African contingent, roughly in the area. It's not huge, but you know, there is a higher proportion of people who have moved from South Africa to England that you would expect to be found in a a big city like that in London, as opposed to other places and so forth. So I think it makes sense to me. I particularly like, also from a cricketing standpoint, that Lords offers something a little bit different, because you have to contend with the slope, that you're playing with, and I think from a just purely a cricketing perspective, having that factor into the final makes for an additional kind of dimensionality to the challenge. So I'm actually very appreciative that it is being held at Lords. I think future, going onwards, yes, that it would be a good idea maybe to explore other countries, like I said. But I think there is an argument to be made that in England, even going at looking at some other venues, to just mix it up a little bit, like England recently hosted Zimbabwe for the first time in 20 odd years, 22 years to be precise, I believe, in Trentbridge. And there was a good, I would say, a fairly decent crowd that showed up for that. I know the occasion was a rare one, with Zimbabwe, getting a return back into the Isles. But I'd imagine that there's some other venues too, and it would help some of the board, and it would help some of the counties too that sometimes struggle with financially and so forth with accruing funds and so forth. So I think it's a good idea. But let's talk about briefly, in that vein, the pitch, because I mentioned the slope. Um, it is hard to say, right? Turning in just a couple of days prior to the game, and seeing the pitch right now, the indications that I've based on the photos that I've seen, it does look fairly greenish. From what I can tell, and the grass covering does seem to be fairly even though, which is a good sign. It doesn't seem to be particularly mottled. Um, but do what I'm curious about, Sanket, is, do you feel, given that there's a couple of things going on, right? So the England versus Zimbabwe test in Trent Bridge, different ground, but that ended up being played on what was a pretty flat pitch. By all estimations, it took a little bit of turn especially in the back end of the game, but really, flat, and not particularly quick, fairly, slow as well. Um, so we do have that to go on. It has been a relatively dry summer. It was indicative in Trent Bridge, as a matter of fact, with the grass covering. Normally can be in this modern area, you see a lot of lush outfields. That was not necessarily the case here. Um, do you feel like the weather may factor into that? Because it is expected, from what I can tell with all the forecasts, to be relatively sunny. Till the second day, it's going to rain a little bit, but then it should clear up by the third day, and so forth. Do, how do you see the pitch being turned out for this particular game, and do you see any comparisons even with the last two test matches that were held for the WTC final, and the pitches that were produced for those?
Yeah, so just talking about the weather, so I arrived here on Friday evening. So Saturday, I think rained pretty much all throughout the day.
Yep.
Uh, it was like proper English weather. It was like, it's not very heavy rain, but it was like very irritating. It like very, it was just, it was
Drizzling all the
basically,
time.
it was just drizzling throughout without ever really stopping. So which is, it's not too bad actually, compared to the kind of rains that we get back home in India, where you're running for cover all the time, and you have you know a storm, and then you have trees falling everywhere, and then you're not even able to see through the window of your car despite the wipers being on at full speed. So it was not that kind of rain, but it was drizzling throughout, and you can't play cricket in that, like, unfortunately, because cricket, maybe if you've already started a match, then you can probably play for some time, but then once you've stopped, or if you're not yet started, then for you to restart the game, and there it has to be completely clear, so you can't play even in the tiniest bit of rain. You can't restart a game even in the tiniest bit of rain. So that's always been one of my pet peeves with cricketing rules, and how rigid they are, particularly given how far dependent our sport is on the weather as compared to some of the other sports, like you know football gets played in the rain. Even tennis nowadays, you have roofs at most of the top stadiums, but even so, you wouldn't see a tennis match being drawn, for example. It will always be rescheduled till the time you finally get a winner. You wouldn't ever say that a tennis tournament has been shared by someone, like you have with cricket, when you have certain matches which are washed out, and then they are no result. Like, you just share the points. You In test matches, you just draw. So you don't quite get that in other sports, like other major outdoor sports. So given how far susceptible cricket is to rain, the weather sometimes can be not very ideal. So yeah, I mean, Sunday was quite good. Sunday was very sunny. uh, Yesterday, I was actually out of London. I'd gone for a day trip to Stonehenge and Bath, where it was quite sunny. But then on my way back to London in the evening, I was seeing the roads were slightly wet. So even though it was not raining at that particular time, I suspect it might have rained a little bit, not very heavily, but again, just a little tiny bit during the day. Today, again, as I can see out, it's not raining or it's not even cloudy. But again, I wouldn't say it's particularly sunny either, and it's almost 10 a.m. So it's not it's not as sunny as it was on Sunday. So the weather is changing a little bit. It might have started off as a very dry summer, and yeah, and as you said, the forecast for the test, there doesn't seem to be any kind of alarms. So I think we should definitely get a result. I think we'll get a proper test match. Like, we won't see a rain affected test match as such, but the weather is it's not a completely dry summer. Like, in 2023, I remember, there was not a single drop of rain for the entirety of the 10 days that I was here in the country. There was not a single drop of rain. It was almost sunny throughout. I'm not seeing that kind of weather this time around. I do think there will be certain spells wherein it is a little cloudy and overcast. And as you said, if there is such kind of weather for the first couple of days of the test match, those are generally the most critical days, because if you get overcast conditions in the morning of the first day, and then one team gets skittled out, then you could end up with a very short test match. So by the time the weather clears up, which is, you say, is day three, the test match would probably already be 70%, 80% on its way to conclusion. Might end in 3 days anyways. So really, I think the first 2 days are critical. Again, I'm not saying that the first 2 days are like a washout, or there will be a great amount of rain. But even if it is a little slightly overcast, and the pitch is slightly wet, or like you said, there is grass on it, excessive amount of grass on it, or even a little bit of grass on it, given the kind of current state of both the batting lineups, given that both the sides are stronger bowling sides than their batting sides, particularly in South Africa's case, they have a very, very inexperienced, very green batting lineup. In Australia's case, it's completely the other way around. They're probably a bit too old, and on the other spectrum of the age group curve. So uh, I think it's like a battle of opposites. You have a very young, inexperienced South African side against uh probably not quite old, but a very very experienced Australian side that is just getting on a bit. I felt that they were vulnerable at times during the India series as well at home. But again, India had their own issues. They were themselves coming off a pretty bad loss to New Zealand. And Australia ultimately just had enough in those crucial moments, like that MCG test, for example, wherein the partnership between Marnus Labuschagne and Josh Hazelwood we were 30 or 40 odd for four in response to India's 165. And Bo Webster came on debut and played a really good innings to take Australia to a competitive first innings total. And then Scott Boland did his thing. So even though the result may read 3-1, there were times, like, particularly in those last two test matches, where it could have gone either way. Obviously, the Brisbane test, Australia were really very unlucky to have been rained out. And if that test had, been played to its natural conclusion, it would have most likely been 4-1. So, but again, even that series showed that there are enough vulnerabilities in this batting lineup that a good attack, like India did not really have a lot of support other than Jasprit Bumrah. So maybe South African attack with maybe slightly better depth than the Indian one, in the right kind of conditions. If they do get, like on the first morning or so, they can cause problems. So uh, yeah, I think the weather is going to play a very significant role in the outcome of it, and particularly with the toss. Now, Lords, I've always believed that Lords is a bat first venue, but it has changed of late. Like over the last few years, there have been occasions where the conditions in England in general, uh, sometimes when it is too, you know, too overcast or too green on day one, then there have been occasions where sides bowling first have taken advantage of the conditions, and then the side, and then the side that's batted first have not been able to recover after being skittled for a low total. So it's a very fine line that you have to balance, particularly when you're not overly confident of your batting lineup as well.
Yep. I mean, I think the point that you make in particular of just having these two batting lineups not being in the prime, if you want to so to speak, or having these kind of fragilities in an end, definitely comes to the fore. I'd say even with the potential concern of age-related decline, you still probably have I mean, you still have a lot better of a batting lineup on paper in that the Australians have, especially with the clean sweep against Sri Lanka. Now, admittedly, it's very likely that the surface that they played on here is going to be a lot different than those two tests that they played in Sri Lanka. One of which wasn't quite the flattest pitch, but that first test match in particular, there was a decent amount of degrees of tone available from day one. I think three and a half or so forth, but it was very slow. It was very even in terms of the predictability of the bounce and tone and so forth. And they given that they were able to amass a very high total on the board. Um, and so despite that tone, right? So there's still a lot of competency, I think, in the Australian batting lineup. But yes, there are fragilities as well, particularly in conditions that are more favorable to the seamers. I feel, um, partially because maybe of that age-related decline, where the reflexes against the quicker bowling is not quite what it may have been at one given point. Um, so I think that definitely comes to the fore. Um, you know, I think with the pitch, the ICC is going to try to, uh, have its say in terms of curating it and so forth. And I think they produced some really good pitches the last two times around. Again, fairly like there was things on offer for the bat and the ball on both of those surfaces. Even if the first one was maybe a little bit more skewed towards the ball than the bat. Um, I see no reason as to why that balance wouldn't be something that we would want to maintain in this game as well. Um, Having said that, I do wonder which side would that benefit more actually. Because if they were to produce a pitch like the oval last time around, right, which starts off relatively greenish and then with you know I mean, with the weather forecast, it's not a guarantee that it'll dry up. But if it was to say dry up, you know, and then kind of flatten out, and then by the back end of the game have a little bit more of an even bounce, it would be interesting to see who that would actually benefit, depending on who wins the toss, like you said, because um, I personally do believe that both of these bowling lineups are some of the best in the world when it comes to especially exploiting any sort of uneven bounce, uh, largely because of just the height of the bowlers that we're contending with. I mean, I know there are a couple of folks in the South African lineup that are going to be playing, that are likely to be playing, I should say, that aren't exactly the tallest. I'm thinking that are bowlers, Wayan Mulder and Dane Paterson in particular. And if they had their other choices that were the fit for this particular game, in Anrik Norkia and a couple of others, it would have been a different circumstances of late. But despite all of that, um, you could still see them having that advantage of being able to enforce, um, or heighten that inconsistency in bounce because of the sheer bounce and high release points that somebody like a Marco Janssen, who will be playing for them in all likelihood, and a RABADA and even a Corbin Bosch could have, right? And when it comes to the Australian attack, as far as that's concerned, they've got three bowlers there that are all well above 6 feet tall. Even if Stark doesn't make the most effective use of that, and because of the his action at the time of release, his knee, he doesn't really get in the tallest position for somebody who's as tall as him. But uh, you still have a situation and a circumstance where there's a very high likelihood of these teams being able to really kind of ram through their advantage if it starts to get exaggerated come the third or fourth innings of the match. But then, like you said, if the pitch is very conducive in the first innings and a team gets scuttled out for, like, say, a sub 150 or even a sub 100 score, then how much can you really account for the advantage that you have with the inconsistency and bounce. So I think that's going to be a really interesting factor. And then especially with Lords and the slope, right, where some of the balls will kind of be a little bit more difficult or tricky, especially the ones that keep lower down the slope, and that nip back in. Um, it does become an interesting question as to whether that also factors in if there is naturally, if there's some variation off the surface in terms of the the vertical component. Um, so I think that's those are all interesting factors to consider in terms of the pitch. But yeah, so that sort of sets the stage for the game, and this test as a as on a broader level, right? On a more generic level. I do want to kind of dive deeper a little bit more into the actual squads that have been selected for each side, and both of these teams, and what construction they could be thinking of, what are some of the perks and disadvantages and so forth. And so actually in that vein, I want to kind of open up the discussion here to you, Sanket, and I kind of wanted to get the Aussie angle first, because there are a couple of contentious issues here, right? Um, to some degree. I'll start with probably the least contentious of the lot, but one that I've still heard some chatter about, and that is the decision to, from what I can tell, to go and stick with Josh Hazelwood over Scott, the prospect of having Scott Boland play in this particular final. What are your thoughts about that? Do you feel that Boland, with his particularly with his difficulty to pick up with those cues, with that you nip backer with the seam of it, and especially given his incredible performances in Test match cricket at home recently, albeit in favorable conditions like the MCG where they played India. Do you feel like it was the right call to indicate that Hazelwood, if fit, is going to star over him in this contest?
Yeah, again, I've been going on about this for quite some time now, and I still don't understand why it is being reduced to Hazelwood versus Boland. Like, Australia on the last couple of Ashes tours have actually left out Mitchell Stark, at the start of the series. Like 2019, he did not play. I think four out of the five tests. I think it ended up only playing the fourth test, which was at Old Trafford. 2023 again, he was left out of the first test, and Australia went in with this exact combination that they could go in now as well if they were to leave out Stark, which is not going to happen. But it has been done before under the very same team management. They went in with Cummins, Hazelwood, Boland, and Nathan Lyon, and this was right after the WTC final against India, in which they did pick both Stark and Boland over Hazelwood because Hazelwood had not yet completely recovered, or they were probably not yet sure about his recovery. So they did go ahead with the guys who had been playing throughout that throughout the majority of that cycle. So Boland had been consistently a part of the side. He had played the Test series against South Africa and the West Indies, and the home Ashes prior to that. And Stark had been pretty much a constant throughout because he's been availability wise, he's probably been Australia's most available bowler in Test cricket. So yeah, he was given the initial preference, but once they saw what happened in that particular Test match, in which Stark was relatively more expensive, then the other two, and they realized that Hazelwood was fit and he could play the first test. Then they went in with the three seamers that they felt were best equipped to English conditions. You know, you have Cummins, Hazelwood, and Boland. Like you mentioned, all of them are channel bowlers, can just, land it on a seam day in, day out, and get the ball to move both ways and then create that uncertainty in a batter's mind about which way the ball is moving. So and they ended up winning that test as well. Even though Boland's own performance might not have been the greatest, he was taken apart by Basball. But again, I think that theory has also been a little overdone because he only played two tests on that tour. Like, Australia played with Stark, Cummins, and Hazelwood as a pace trio at Old Trafford in the fourth test of that series, and they were absolutely flogged apart. That was
Yeah.
the worst that an Australian attack has performed in England for quite some time, and it was without Scott Boland. So this theory that Scott Boland can't bowl in England or that he can only bowl in Australia, uh, that's not. I'm not quite sure. I buy into that. He played the WTC final uh, at the Oval in English conditions, and he was the best bowler on show for Australia. So just the two test matches in relatively more friendly batting conditions against a side playing a very, very unique brand of cricket, which is somehow you probably have never quite come across in first class cricket before. For someone like Boland who doesn't play white ball cricket as well. So it is understandable why he might have been, slightly overwhelmed by that particular challenge because he was coming up against something that you've scarcely seen in Test history. That kind of aggression that we've seen from the English side under Brandon McCullum, where you have basically treated like an ODI game, and you score at a rate of over five and over consistently. And Boland is not the greatest limited overs bowler, even in domestic cricket. So
I think he
maybe
averages what 40
yeah, even
in
in domestic list A cricket.
yeah.
So I think purely for that particular matchup, given the kind of skills that were required, maybe he was not the right fit at the time. But like I said, even Stark, Cummins, and Hazelwood were not spared the punishment. Like Australia lost the fourth. I mean, Australia didn't lose the fourth test, but they would have lost the fourth test in all likelihood if that match had not had two complete days washed out by rain. And then again, the fifth test as well, Australia ended up losing with those three playing. Obviously Nathan Lyon was not there after the first test, and then maybe the half an innings of the Lord's test. So that was a significant setback as well, because he was Australia's best bowler in the Edgbaston test, who had come to grips with the challenges of baseball. So who knows if that he'd been available for the entire series, Australia could have won that. But again, that's all conjecture. But the larger point that I'm trying to make is that writing off Scott Boland based on his failures, so to speak, against that particular batting lineup in those circumstances, I think would be a little bit unfair. And if that is the reason why Mitchell Stark is being chosen over him, even though they had initially ruled Boland to be a better fit than Stark for those conditions, as evidenced by the selection at Edgbaston, then I'm not too sure I agree with that. So, yeah, I mean, I think against this South African side, you wouldn't really expect the kind of challenges that you did from England. They wouldn't really come hard at you. And again, it's a very inexperienced batting lineup. So I think, irrespective of whoever is picked, I think they should be very confident of getting the job done. This is not to disrespect South Africa or undermine them, but if I think there is a challenge coming from South Africa in this test, it will be through their bowling. It is. I mean, I do not see any circumstances in which this batting lineup can really, put Australia under pressure and get those big scores of 400 or 500. For South Africa to win this test, they would need it to be a very low scoring test in which, someone like a Rabada or a Janssen just goes berserk for a session and then takes out the Australian batting lineup, and then you have a low scoring shootout in which South Africa prevail. But if this test is on the higher scoring spectrum, then it's very difficult to see how South Africa can match up to the kind of experience Australia have in the batting lineup. Uh, Even though, like I said, they're not maybe at their best anymore, but there is still enough quality in those ranks to really make it count when it is needed. Whereas South Africa, Yeah, so I think Stark, I think he's going to probably bowling to Ryan Rickleton or Tony DeZorzi, so they will have a left-handed opener. So that's a good matchup for him. So I think Stark, I think one of his biggest, I think inevitabilities as a Test match opening bowler over the last few years has been like how good he is against left-handed openers. We saw that even with Yashasvi Jaiswal in the series in Australia, where he was, even though he was not quite a bunny. He did score his fair share of runs against Stark as well, but there were still three occasions in which he was, bundled out in single digits. Like there were a couple of ducks as well. So yeah, I mean, yeah, irrespective of whoever is picked, I think they should be in a good enough position to do the job. I think purely if you ask me who I would be picking, then I think if you just ask me who the best bowlers are for the conditions, then my opinion would be the same as what Australia had picked last time at Edgbaston, purely based on the skill set and the style of bowling. I would think that Cummins, Hazelwood, and Boland are better equipped. They're more consistent and are more likely to pose a consistent challenge to South African batters than Stark. But like I said, there are enough vulnerabilities in the South African batting lineup that Stark, despite his relative inconsistencies to others, he should still have like enough opportunities to exploit the porousness in the South African lineup. So I reckon it should be fine. But yeah, if it were to me, it would be Cummins, Hazelwood, and Boland.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's a couple of really good observations there on your end, in particular the mentioning of the left-handers, right there. There, especially with Tony DeZorzi, he's he's played what 11 Test matches at this point. He averages about 30. He's not exactly with all due respect, he's not exactly the strongest a left-handed opener that South Africa has produced even in the last 10, 15 years. And I think that absence of Dean Elgar, who was notoriously, capable of evading the edge by playing inside the line of the ball um, and so forth, would have come handy. Although he did struggle in his last tour, by admission, to Australia because they were able to cramp him and bounce him out with balls that were going to be going down the leg side and so forth. Um, but I think, to your point, um, I do actually see a lot of merit in playing both Boland and Hazelwood together. Boland, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, he seems to have. It's very hard to pick from his action the cues that would indicate the nip backer. Um, with the scrambled seam and so forth, and I think that could come very handy. Now, obviously, if it is overcast, right, as predicted in the first couple of days, somebody like a Stark, um, given sufficient cloud cover in particular, I wouldn't say talk about the moisture per se, but particular cloud cover, um, with the turbulence, you could see potentially some uh, assistance for swing come about. And even if you don't, I do feel that Stark in some recent times has been a little bit more capable of using the seam. Or been more willing, I should say, to use the seam than just swinging it around. He does come from a tour in Sri Lanka, admittedly likely to be very different conditions from what are going to be offered here in terms of the pitch, if we're assuming it's going to play to the oval pitch like last time. But he did have a good series. He took 6 wickets, I think average of uh, 15 or so. He wasn't used that much, admittedly, but he is coming in good form. So it's not a matter of just somebody who's completely rusty coming out of shape. Um, but yeah, I think there is some good merit to that. You also have Bo Webster in this lineup. As a potential bowling option, especially given that from what reports seem to indicate, Cameron Green's going to play, but because of concerns over his fitness to be able to bowl with the injury and all that he had suffered, um, there is a chance that they may go in with a seam bowling all rounder as they did in Sri Lanka for you know a match and then also against India the MCG where uh, Webster made his debut, right? And that's actually something I wanted to ask you about too. Do you feel like they should go ahead with somebody like a Webster as that fifth bowling option, that all rounder kind of capability? Should they go in with potentially? I know Josh Inglis also made his Test debut in that Sri Lanka series, and he did fairly well during that tour. And I know Alex Carey's also been picked here. Um, is there room potentially to pick both keepers and leave out Webster? Would it be a better idea to pick Webster and leave out maybe Inglis, given the seniority, I guess, of Carey and him being more established? Or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think so. Regarding, I think Carey, I think he's probably been Australia's best batter over the last 12 months. I don't think there should be any kind of questions over his place in the side. He was one of the Australian batters who consistently scored during the India series as well, even though it might not have been big runs, but he was consistently one of the bowlers, one of the batters who looked comfortable throughout, even against Bumrah. He did not look like out of place like some of the other batters might have in the earlier parts of the series. Uh, so and then he played that innings in Sri Lanka, which I think remains one of the greatest innings ever played by an Australian batter in Asian conditions, without a shadow of a doubt. He came in when this test and the series was in the balance, and those are the circumstances from which Australia have lost overseas series in the past, like the 2017 Dharamshala test, for example. Australia just needed one big innings from someone somewhere, either in the first innings or second innings, you know, to really post a commanding total for India to chase in the fourth innings, and they failed to do that. Likewise in Delhi in 2023, for example, or even the goal test in 2022, which the second test, which Australia ended up losing. Those are the circumstances in which Australia have had, series within their grasp and if they've let go of those opportunities. And it was seeming like it would be a similar case again after dominating the first test and then also having been on top at various points during the second test, having bundled Sri Lanka out relatively cheaply. But then, you're three down for very little on the board. And then it was that Smith Carey partnership, which single handedly almost took Australia to the series win, which is their first series win in Sri Lanka in like 15 years or 14 years rather. So
Yeah.
I think it is one of the most important innings played by an Australian, batsman, not just a wicketkeeper, but I'd say any batsman overseas over the last 10, 15 years. And he's also been consistently good, elsewhere as well. He scored runs against India. He scored he scored runs in ODIs cricket. After, a lull during the 2022-23 phase, which culminated in him being dropped during the World Cup, he's
Y-
gonna come back into his own. I think his innings in the Champions Trophy semi-final against India, even though in a losing cause, was again one of the best I've seen in really difficult conditions. So for me, Kerry is a walk-up start, without a shadow of a doubt. So I think the choice, like you said, between Inglis and Webster. Uh, well, for me, I think more than his bowling, Webster, I think it is his batting that has really stood out for me in the three tests that he's played. So the test at Sydney is played, I think, in one of the most difficult surfaces that Australia played on in recent times, and it was his innings that actually ended up making the difference. Like without his innings, Australia would have probably even conceded a first innings lead, like a significant first innings lead, uh, like they did at Perth to India. They would have ended up, in a very similar situation without his innings and without that partnership that he had with Steve Smith. And then even with the runs that he added, I think he scored 30, 40 runs with the tail as
he's
well.
also I'll just quickly interject here.
Yeah,
He's also a fantastic puller of the ball. It has
yeah,
to be said.
he is a very good back foot player. He's very tall. So again, when you talk about the South African attack and the kind of bounce that they get, he has a very good matchup against them, because of his abilities to pull the short pitch delivery. I think the one possible vulnerability in his game could be, the relatively fuller ball and swinging delivery, purely because of how tall he is, and just, getting that bat down in time might be a bit of a challenge that has challenged Cameron Green as well so far in his Test career. But again, I do not see any bowlers in the South African attack, in the current South African attack, that would really challenge that particular aspect of his game. Like maybe a Vernon Philander would have like a few years ago. But right now, the kind of attack that they've got, they're all primarily hit the deck bowlers. Like you don't really have anyone who's going to like swing it or seam it from a fuller length like a Dale Steyn or a Vernon Philander.
I'd say
So
probably the closest to that would be, somebody like a Janssen. Janssen can get some in swing with the left-handed. He does try to get the ball into the right-hander, but then to that point, Bo Webster is probably going to be coming in at a point where he's not going to be
yeah,
exposed to the new ball, which is where
yeah, 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 yeah. So that would be the thing. And I think also his innings in Sri Lanka, like again, after that Smith Carey partnership, Australia did have a bit of a collapse, and Bo Webster again chipped in with like I think 40 runs or 35 something runs. Again, that was very crucial runs because first innings lead was going to be very crucial in that particular match for Australia. Uh, and given how Sri Lanka fought in their second innings with Kusal Mendis scoring those runs, and ultimately, I think those runs did end up proving to be pivotal because if Australia had to chase like a very significant total in the fourth innings, like a 150 or a 200, then it could have been a different ball game. Like chasing in the fourth innings in Sri Lanka is always tricky. So I think Bo Webster, like he's played three Test matches in those he's played two innings that I would say were been absolutely pivotal in Australia winning series that they haven't won for a long time, like beating India anywhere for the first time in 11 years or and beating Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka for the first time in 14 years. So I don't think you can really argue with those with that kind of start to his career. So I think he definitely deserves to start the final. He is one of the reasons why Australia have qualified for the final. So for me, there's no doubt that he absolutely deserves to play. Inglis, yeah, I mean he did play a very good innings in the first Sri Lanka test, but I think you also have to consider the circumstances. He came in with the score, I think, like 400 for three or something like that, and Sri Lanka were already in the back foot, after the double hundred by Usman Khawaja and Steve Smith having completely, put them on the ropes. Josh Inglis came out and actually just pulverized a very tired attack. So I wouldn't quite rate those innings on par with what Webster achieved either side of that. So for me, right now on performance, Bo Webster deserves to play over Josh Inglis. Obviously, there is the added advantage of his bowling as well. But again, I'm not very, I wouldn't consider that as a significant amount of factor in his selection, other than the fact that he's probably going to bowl like 5, 6 overs in a day just to give the frontline seamers a bit of a breather. But I wouldn't really count him as a genuine wicket taking threat in a way that someone like Cameron Green might be at his best. I don't see Bo Webster's bowling being like really challenging, you know. But I think it's going to be more of a filler rather than someone who's a genuine wicket taking option. But as a batsman, and again and he's also brilliant in the gully region as well
yep.
as a catcher. So purely based on whatever he's done in his career so far, I'm not saying he's going to have a very long Test career with Australia, but based on whatever he's done till now, he definitely has earned the right to start this particular game for sure.
Yeah, I think I agree largely with your sentiments too. I am a admirer of Josh Inglis, the batsman against spin in particular, but and I know that South Africa have a very good spinner in Keshav Maharaj, but the thing is, given what is likely to be anticipated in terms of the conditions, it's probably not likely that they're going to go in with a multi-spin attack, right? That they're going to field. Maybe Aiden Markham might bowl a couple of overs, but that's going to be the extent of it. And their second spinner, Senyaran Muthuswamy, is really, honestly, somebody who I rate a lot more from a batting perspective as more of a hitter than really a frontline spinner. He doesn't really turn it very much, and he turns in the same direction as Amaraj, and he's a step down in terms of quality, I would say, in particular. So that advantage that you would have with English of being able to counter spin very effectively, it doesn't really factor in as much, I think, in my estimation. So I think Bo Webster, even if you're just looking from the different strengths and like you said, being able to contend with the bounce of the South African attack, I think that's a good pick. Um, it is in the thing that you mentioned about the incoming ball. Like I mentioned, Janssen might be able to exploit that, but there's a very good chance that he's not going to be bowling up front to him early on, so he might get established. The only other bowler I see potentially doing that kind of role, because you mentioned Vernon Philander, is a Dan Peterson if he gets selected. He does bowl a bit of scramble seam. He gets the nip backer, but his length is not necessarily always the fullest. So that's also a contention. Um, so I think going with Webster would probably be the right choice. It is actually funny you mentioned the thing about the gully. He kind of reminds me of Joel Garner in the gully. Super tall people. You don't usually expect a super tall fielder to be extremely effective in that region, but because you feel like they might not be able to bend or reach in time to grab those lower balls, but because of the reach that they have with their height, they're actually able to intercept a lot of balls that are going wide and so forth. And I think that can be in either direction. Actually, that can be very handy. Um, so I think there's a lot of merit of just sticking with Bo Webster and giving him that chance. And uh, obviously with Kerry playing those innings that he played, he got a 98 in the successful chase that they had in New Zealand as well. Actually, as a matter of fact, I recall when they went 2-0 up. Granted, again, those were conditions where the surface had kind of petered out. I would say it wasn't as difficult to bat on, but it's still it was a tight chase, and his efforts were pretty handy in that respect at the Hagley Oval. So I think there's a lot of merit to just stick with those two, and Inglis probably can get future chances as the next cycle unfolds. I'd imagine. I think the final thing that kind of interests me from a selection standpoint, right? From the Australian side of things, is the decision of Marnus and Sam Constas, right? Sam Constas, he comes in uh, and makes his debut at the MCG, and has this frenetic, what I would only describe as a frenetic, wild kind of innings, where he's what hitting Bumrah for six with a bunch of scoops, but he's also missing the ball like 30% of the time. Um, but he was a bit of a gambler, and the gamble paid off against that lineup. Then they go to Sri Lanka, doesn't really get and I, selected an eye in for that. And then from there, we have this World Test Championship final where they've decided to open up with Marnus. Now, Marnus has had his own issues from a form standpoint, although that hasn't been the worst of late. He's managed to score some runs in that India series, a couple of runs and so forth. Even in England, when his form was in doubt, he was able to get a couple of knocks underway. Um, the question is, do you feel like it was the right call to go with Marnus to open? I know they've tried Smith in the past as an opener and it didn't quite pan out in the limited run that they had. Do you think there were other choices available to them? Do you feel like having that makeshift option in Marnus was the best call?
Well, have they made the decision? I don't think it's been confirmed anywhere. So I still think it's like the reports that I've been reading in the trading media is that they're trying to keep their cards close to the chest. But yeah, I think if you're asking about what is more likely, then yeah, it does seem that to be that they're leaning towards that. Mon playing over Sam Constas. So again, I think it's a very tricky decision because again, like I said, one you have to factor in the age curve of this Australian side. So they desperately, and I think this is something that was acknowledged by the coach himself, Andrew McDonald, as well in one of the interviews. That they desperately need to start getting in some of the younger batsmen into the side. They need to get games into them so that by the time some of these senior players retire, they it is not it is a phased transition rather than all of them going out at one point. Like you've already have David Warner's retired and Australia still haven't really nailed down an opener to replace him. Like You've had three or four guys being tried. I think Marnus would be the fourth different person to open, if he does open tomorrow. So you already have a bit of uncertainty regarding that, and there is Kawaja as well, who it is suspected might retire at the end of the Ashes, home Ashes, even though it's not been confirmed anywhere. Steve Smith, I mean, there have been speculations that he wants to carry on till 2027 because of his unfulfilled, goals of winning in India and in England away from home. But again, his interviews off late have like tended to have a more of a cautious tone to it, and he's said that he's not looking too far ahead and he's just trying to take it one series at a time, rather than outrightly stating that he's wants to play for another couple of years is not quite being as committal as he was in the past. So he has interests elsewhere as well in the T20 leagues in America, and so we don't quite know what the plan is. I think Khawaja was like very close to probably being dropped even last summer, when he was, like in his own words, he was getting boomeranged. But then he got the double century in Sri Lanka, and now it seems to be fine. He did not have the greatest of summer before that as well against Pakistan and the West Indies. But the double hundred in Sri Lanka definitely bought him time. So, barring a significant catastrophe in the next four games, you would expect him to open in the Ashes. You know, and then whether he does get to bow out on his own terms or whether he's forced out by the selectors, that is something that will probably depend on his performances over the next few months. And then again, like I said, with Smith not being overly committal, you have got two guys who are in the mid to late 30s, who could potentially go out at the same time, and you still haven't replaced the one guy that is already gone, which is David Warner. So you potentially might need three new replacements at one time. And in that sense, then someone like Marnus Labuschagne actually becomes very critical to the side, because he would then become one of the senior blokes in the lineup alongside Travis Head. And his tip in form has come at possibly the worst possible time for Australia when they are nearing this kind of transition. And he's not really got any runs of note since the Old Trafford test, in the Ashes in 2023. He's not scored a test 100 since then. There have been some useful contributions. He got a 80 odd in New Zealand. He got those twin 50s in Melbourne against India, which were very critical to winning that test. But there have been no real consistent performances that would give the team management any kind of reassurance that this guy is going to be around for a while, and that he's become almost as vulnerable to being axed as anyone else. So if Smith and Kawaja do go out at the same time, then is he ready to take on that mantle of being the senior batsman? So that's another thing to factor in when you decide whether you want to give him another opportunity, or if you want to give him, how long do you want to give him, or whether it's time to start bringing in the next generation of players like Sam Constas. Now, apparently, Sam Constas has worked a lot on his technique during the off season, so he was widely panned for his technique and approach during that India series. Like, I mean, he did definitely ruffle a few feathers, not just in the Indian camp, but even in the Australian media and the ex cricketers. They did not like quite what they saw in terms of his approach, even though you might have, even though it did achieve the desired result in the end. And you could argue it was probably necessary at the time, given the kind of stranglehold that Bumrah had on the Australian batters in the first three Test matches. That onslaught from Constas definitely did end up, tipping the scales of the series, a little bit in Australia's favor. So even though he might not have scored a lot of runs on paper, but just the psychological impact of that particular morning might have been felt by India over the next couple of Test matches. Obviously, Bumrah being injured midway through the Sydney Test definitely helped as well in that fourth innings chase, over there. But uh, then he had another game in the Sheffield Shield wherein he was got out trying to scoop Scott Boland, and again he was that generated a lot of controversy, and it was, like, this young arrogant young kid who's not respecting the game enough, and headlines like that in the Australian media. So after that, and after all that criticism that he's received, then he sort of buckled down and scored a couple of 50s towards the end of the season, playing a more conventional brand of cricket, which is what actually got him selected in the first place. He was never selected as like a David Warner kind of replacement. He was always actually meant to be more of a traditional style of opener. So seeing what he did on Test debut actually came out as a bolt out of the blue to me as well. Like I definitely was not anticipating that from him, having followed his domestic career. So now the reports seem to be that he seems to have been working on his technique to switch back to his old style of playing and become more of a traditional opener. He's worked on his technique. Apparently, looked very good in the nets against the Australian first choice attack, which is obviously good news. Whether that's enough to get him selected, or I don't know. Like because Cameron Green is almost confirmed to play as a specialist bat, and I do not see Australia going in with less than five bowlers. So Bo Webster will definitely play as well. So really, it becomes a straight choice to open between Marnus and uh, Constance, because I don't think the Steve Smith is going to be mucked around with again in his career. Like whatever little he's got left, I think he's going to stay at four. So whatever adjustments are to be made will be made elsewhere. So you got Cameron Green at three, even though he's not batted there much in his first class career, but he's batted at four. So 4 to 3, he says it's not big of not much of a step up. So and he's always batted at three in his junior career as well. So that's not a big issue. But when it comes to opening again, like I tend to sort of side with the view of the Australian management that I think sometimes we tend to overemphasize on the importance of opening as a very specialist position, whereas there have been a number of examples, in Test history about successful middle order batters who've converted to being pretty successful openers, like Virender Sehwag. You've got Tilakaratne Dilshan, I think, is a very good example because he actually converted himself into an opener very late in his career. Unlike maybe a Sehwag who, was moved around fairly early when he was still quite new to this test scene. Dilshan, I think, only moved up to open when he was in his mid 30s, and that was based on the success that he had as an opener in limited overs cricket. And he made a very pretty decent fist of it for a couple of years as well. So and these are very recent examples. There have been players who've done it in the past as well. So I'm not against the idea of middle order batters, being moved up to open, just so that you can get your best six batters in, rather than getting in a specialist opener who does not belong in your top 6 or 7 batters, to just for the sake of having the tag of a specialist opener, so to speak. But whether Manas is like in his current form, whether he is ready for that challenge, he's not scored much runs in his county stint that he's had. Even in Nets, he's apparently been struggling. So if they do go ahead with him, I think it will, signal what I had said about that they are concerned about the transition period ahead, and they desperately need Marnus to lead that transition of the Australian batting lineup that's going to happen. And Australia cannot afford to lose Marnus Labuschagne at the age of 30, 31. Like, this is too early an age for like a permanent kind of decline. They will hope that this is a temporary blip and that he will get back to his uh, usual ways, in the coming few test matches, and definitely with the Ashes coming up at home as well. Because if he's not, you know, got his act together by then I think it's a matter of serious concern for Australia. So I think they're giving him all the opportunity that they can to rediscover his best touch. But at the same time, they also want to get games into Sam Constance as well. So there has been a theory that they're playing Labuschagne for the WTC final, and that Sam Constance will come in the West Indies because that is seen as a relatively easier challenge, uh, and relatively easy way for him to ease into Test cricket, even though he arguably had the greatest challenge against Jasprit Bumrah at his peak already. But in terms of the overall quality of the opposition and the lack of pressure, and Australia being very comfortable favorites for the series, you could say that West Indies might not be a bad opportunity for him to ease in. But again, what happens if Marnus gets like, obviously if he scores a big 100, then I think that's the best possible news for Australia, and that he could just carrying on from there, score runs in West Indies, and then really set himself up for a big summer. But what if he he gets a 30 odd or a 35, which is like neither here nor there. It's not bad enough for him to be dropped, but it's also not good enough like to really convince you that he's back to his best. Then what do you do? Do you still go? Do you give him more games in the West Indies, and then you lose the opportunity of giving Sam Constas that valuable amount of experience and medal, or you know, where you're still banking on him, Manus, that is getting back to his best and eventually, uh, going back to his run scoring levels from pre 2023. So it's a very difficult call. Again, I don't personally have any strong opinions on it. I can see merits in both sides of the argument. On one hand, you have one guy who was supposed to have been leading the Australian batting lineup by now, but who hasn't quite lived up to the original expectations. Like after the initial sky high, like couple of seasons wherein he was averaging 60 at one point of time, and there were murmurs that he's the next Steve Smith, based on similarities in terms of their obsessiveness for cricket, some sort of similarities in the technique, personalities as well. But yeah, in terms of talent, in terms of just the range of shots, and in terms of abilities, they're not quite in the same class. So it was always expected that there would be some sort of mean reversion for Marnus. His first class record is obviously nowhere near Steve Smith's was when he was selected as well. So I mean, that was always, I think, a very unrealistic expectation to expect him to be the next Steve Smith. But for him to just fall apart in the manner that he has over the last 18 months or so, that will concern the Australian selectors. So I think if they want to give him the all the opportunity they can to get back to his best, then I'm all for it. At the same time, if they want to have a look at newer talent, and like if they feel that Sam Constas is going to be your next generation, and he's going to lead the next generation of Australian batters, maybe if not immediately, then maybe another 3 4 years down the line, and they want to get games into him, then I think that would be an entirely justifiable call as well. So it's a tricky decision with no right or wrong answers. I think only time will tell, like the cliche goes, on what whether they get it right or not. So yeah.
No, I think that's yeah, like you said, there's definitely the pros and cons to either decision to pick or not to pick. With Constas, I know I mean the even Ponting has admitted as much that um, he's basically been seen as a bit of a prodigy, right? Actually, similar in a mold to Ponting, as a matter of fact, in terms of some of the imperious stroke play, particularly with the pull and so forth. From his under 19 days, one of the observations I've made for a long time, and I don't think he's quite fixed it. I know you've mentioned that he's been working the nets. They've been trying to correct his technique and so forth. But I remember in the under 19 World Cup that was held, I think this was a couple of years back. Raj Limbani from India in particular troubled him a ton with the in swinger, and he's always struck me as somebody who is a good LBW candidate because of how he doesn't quite cover the he kind of plays in front of his pad essentially, and so um, I felt that that was always going to be an element of a weakness in his game that would be exploited. I don't think in that MCG innings it was that he played it was really exploited enough by the seam bowlers, including Bumrah early on. With Marnus, it's a very interesting question too, right? Because there's a couple of things. I was looking into some analysis was conducted of him, and I was looking and based on the footage I've been watching as well, there are a couple of things that are very obviously happening in his game that are really uh, causing him to struggle. One of the things is just that he doesn't come on the front foot against seam bowlers as much. It seems. I think I remember seeing a stat of how when he was having that period of form where he was averaging what was it 55 plus or so forth in Test match cricket after he had come back in the Ashes as a replacement for Smith. This is way back, admittedly, in the 2019 Ashes, and then there's a period for a good 3 years where he was performing very well. Um, and what was noticeable was that more than half of the time when it came to the seamers, he was on the front foot, and he was smothering the ball, he was intercepting it, and basically being in a position where he could cover or the line of the ball and length of the ball before it deviated too much off the surface, or you know the natural direction of the swing ended up taking its course um, through the air and so forth. So I think that's a place where from a technical standpoint he struggled. Um, Obviously, he's had some issues with his average being cut in half compared to that peak era. I think it was like 49 and 21 with the nip backer. But I think for him the bigger concern is just he was notoriously very good at leaving the ball even when it was relatively close to his stumps. And I think there's been this issue where he's been chasing a little bit more at the away swinger as well. He's been nicking off a little bit more than you would normally expect. And even his sense of judgment of that off stump, there's almost like a foot, of distance. I mean, in one of the pieces I was seeing about, analyzing it based off the data, he's leaving balls on average that are a foot away than he normally would have. And that might not seem like a ton, but it really does matter because if you don't have that judgment as an opener to leave balls effectively that are even coming in tight to you, but that you can defend the ones that are gonna, in all likelihood hit. That's like one of the key skills that you need as an opener and so forth. So that there is definitely questions about that. Like you mentioned, he hasn't had the best county stint, although I think there are some mitigating circumstances with that. In particular, that match in Glamorgan that he played definitely was played on a fairly bowler friendly surface. Not much you could do there with those conditions. But I think it is it's a coin flip toss. Khwaja has come back and said that he would back the move. And he'd be the other opener on the other end. So that to me is an indication that probably leading in that direction. But again, like you said, it's a coin flip. Um, but yeah, I think those are sort of really the thoughts that and questions I had from a Australian standpoint in terms of selection. But yeah, Sanket, I think you had some questions for me from a South African perspective in terms of the squad, and um, I'd be happy to chime in and knowing what those are.
Yes, I think we were discussing earlier about the composition of the South African attack. So I think you had mentioned Dane Paterson as one potential seamer who could possibly bowl that scramble seam delivery, from a slightly fuller length than some of the others, and pose those challenges to Australian batters. So now Dane Paterson basically came into the side as a replacement because of the unavailability of the frontline bowlers.
Yep.
He's done a relatively decent job in the absence. Like he played against Pakistan, he played against Sri Lanka, and he's played against Bangladesh. Now that is not the greatest set of opposition to really be judging a fast bowler's performances on. Like because particularly Pakistan and Sri Lanka at home is about as easy a challenge as you could get as a fast bowler. And he's not the youngest either, so he's 36. So it's not like you're investing in a young bowler for the future. I know this is a final, and you're not necessarily thinking about the future, about from a long term perspective. And you're just possibly, picking the best possible side that is there to win this fixture. But I always tend to look at the age of players just to know like his long term, like his actual ceiling. And I'm always trying to be skeptical of these late bloomers who suddenly have like one great season, even though they have very mediocre career records, and then suddenly have one great season, and then there are calls for them to be picked for the national side based on that. And then when they do get picked, then they eventually get exposed as not quite being good enough for that level. And there is obviously a reason why they've only come into their own so late in their careers. So for me, I think now Lungi Ngidi was injured, and I think he missed the entirety of the South African home summer. He has been their first choice, like one of their first choice seamers for the best part of the last, what, 3 4 years, along with Janssen and Rabada. They have been the three constants. Like the fourth seamer has kept on changing. They've had Andrek Nokia at times. Is obviously had his injury concerns. They've had tried Gerald Kutsia in that particular role. There's Andre Berger, and
They're
we've
all
also,
injured, but
yeah,
which is yeah.
they're all injured right now, and they've also had Vian Mulder obviously as an all rounder as well, uh, who's consistently played. So my question to you would be, not right now they have like, so when I was talking about these players with who have mediocre overall records, but who are on the negative side of the age curve. So I think one name that immediately springs to mind is Corbin Bosch. Like his first class average, bowling average, is 36. His list A average is again very similar. Uh, he had he's played one test. He took 5 wickets and it is at an average of 23. But that's not really a sample size to go on, is it? So his first class numbers are, I mean, I wouldn't even say they're mediocre. They are actually below average, for someone who plays his home matches in South Africa. I realize that the pitches in South Africa in domestic cricket might not be quite as seam friendly as the pitches that you get for test matches over there. But still, I mean, an average of 36 for a 30-year-old in first class cricket does not scream of a future great. Definitely. You've got Dane Paterson, who's 36, again, who's played only really due to the absence of the frontline quicks. So, what now that you have Lungi Ngidi back from injury, who has a test average of 20, 23, 24, who's younger than both of those two, who's 29, has been playing test cricket for the last 6 years, I believe, 6, 7 years, made his debut in 2018 against India. Uh, you've got him back. You've obviously got Jansen and Rabada. I think our World Cup starts. I think no real questions asked there. So then you've got the third and the fourth seamer. I think those are the spots that will probably be most debated over. So you've got a choice between either a Vian Mulder and a Corbin Bosch for the all rounders role. So you've got Mulder, who's been someone whom they've tried as a someone whom they've invested in quite a lot. Uh, at one point of time, he used to have first class numbers that were like almost the parallel of Sir Garfield's Open. There were even jokes on Twitter as well about South Africa have the next Calais or they have the next Sobers. He's not quite lived up to that, but he seems to be getting better. Like he's scored a test 100 in Bangladesh in conditions which you would normally wouldn't expect a South African young batter to be a natural in. So that is definitely something to look forward to. They score 100 in Bangladesh. Obviously, these are different conditions, and his record in the seam friendly conditions with the bat is not quite so good. As a bowler, he picks up like 1.5 wicket per match. So it's not. He doesn't bowl a lot of overs, doesn't pick up a lot of wickets per match. But again, it has improved in recent times. He's put in some decent performances. You've got Vian Mulder, someone they've been investing in for a long time. Has not quite lived up to the high expectations, but seems to be slowly getting better. And on the other hand, you've got Corbin Bosch, who's more of someone who's been picked due to a bit of a purple patch late in his career. Doesn't have the greatest numbers overall. It probably has better batting numbers than he has bowling numbers. But even as a batsman, he averages 41 in first class cricket, but doesn't have 100. So just got over 1,500 runs. And in list A cricket, he's got like just over 500 runs. So for someone who's 30 years old, he's hardly played any cricket. So that's a very low sample size to pick on. So again, I don't follow South African cricket very religiously domestically. So I'm just going on based on whatever the overall numbers are. But if you have followed their careers more closely, I think you'd be able to shed a better light on this one, on why he suddenly made it to the Test squad. Given that South Africa, I believe, have one of the deepest talent pools for fast bowling in world cricket. Why is someone with this kind of record made it to a WTC final? Granted, there have been some injuries, but always thought that South Africa had more options than this. Then you also have Dane Paterson, who's again uh, done a very respectable job. Coming in as a change bowler when the first choice were injured, but now when you got Lungi Ngidi back to full fitness, played a couple of matches in the IPL as well, did well in one of them. So was bowling at a decent pace, which I think is more important than anything else because T20 cricket, obviously, you can't really extrapolate that to Test cricket, but purely from the point of view of his fitness, which has plagued him at times over the last few years, that he seems to be bowling, his pace seems to vary a lot between games, but he's bowling at a decent pace. Obviously, that's T20, but I think overall I saw positive signs with regards to his fitness in whatever, like 2 or 3 matches that he played. So now that you've got him back as well, so which way are you leaning with regards to the selections? And
Yeah,
also,
so
with regards to the batting lineup. So again, I think it's a choice probably between Ryan Rickleton and Tony DeZorzi. DeZorzi has 100 in Bangladesh, but after that, he's not really done anything. Rickleton is a fixture in the limited over sides, scored some runs over the home summer, is a regular in the IPL, so more of a known fixture. But again, that's not really, relevant to the Test match selection. But he is someone who's seen as one for the future. They also have transformation targets as well, I believe, to take into consideration. So that is another layer that adds to the complexities of the selection. So yeah, go on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so the obviously I think the first thing, right, that is, that struck you is very very strange, and definitely is on the minds of a lot of people as well, is with Corbin Bosch, right, being selected in that role, um, and being in potentially called up for such a big tour match like this, having only played the one test against Pakistan. Um, so I think with Corbin Bosch, it's more just the potential at play, right? Um, it's the fact that he can bowl very quick. He regularly touches 140, kilometers per hour. So regularly can touch that 90 mile per hour mark. Um, he's been he's a very explosive bowler, and I think that's in part what kind of explains the poor stats from a perspective of he's not somebody who can really provide a ton of control usually. He actually made his name earlier in the ironically enough, in the T20 and the ODI circuit for he played in the CPL, for example, and did well in a couple of matches there a couple of years back, and so on and so forth. His father actually was a very explosive bowler, a very quick bowler on his own, and kind of there are a lot of similarities between the older Bosch and the younger Bosch in that regard. Unfortunately, his father was a victim of a very tragic incident, but um, to your point about Corbin Bosch, so I think the batting and the bowling, he's really picked on being a raw kind of potential talent. He has had some injury issues from what I recall in the past that have kind of dogged him, which is why he hasn't played as much as well. The biggest advantage of him, I don't think he really moves the ball a ton in the air, which is a disadvantage, but I think he really has sort of an action where he can rush the batters, right? Um, and because of the angle at which he releases the ball, he can often make batsmen play at balls that would be wider than they should have to play at. Now, that I think that's probably one of the bigger picks. So even when the ball isn't moving that much, he can, because of the angle of his release, he can kind of essentially create that uncertainty. And I think if they do pick him, they're going to pick him in part because he can add that extra dimensionality of that raw pace, right? Yes, somebody like Rabada can be quick at times, but if you've noticed in a lot of Test matches, there are some exceptions like the one in the West Indies when at home where he kind of ramped it up. But these days he really operates a lot more in that mid 130s pace range, and he's such a terrific bowler that it doesn't matter, right? A lot of the times, it's kind of like with Bumrah, where the skill set is so immense that they don't need to be operating consistently or even clocking very often at that 145, uh, you know, kph mark. But I think in the absence of an Anrik Norkia, uh, that's where a Corbin Bosch comes in as a more like for like replacement. And with his batting, I will say he's kind of strange because unlike say Bo Webster, who we were discussing a little bit earlier, one of the things that struck out to me when I was watching him play in that Kingsmead Test, and I've seen him play a couple of times more. He's actually not that good of a player of the short ball, from what I can tell. Khurram Shehzad, who's not by any means the tallest or quick, or for that matter, even the most uh, you know, uh, fastest quick, right? Somebody who really operates in that 130, 135 kph, bracket at best with the 135, and often can even be in the 120s, the high 120s, and so forth. Um, there were plenty of moments there, and even a couple of moments I can think of against Naseem Shah where he was pulling, and either the ball took the top edge or he wasn't able to connect as cleanly. I mean, he would get the boundary against them because some of those deliveries were kind of half trackers, but they weren't you know as assured as you would maybe stereotypically expect for somebody who's brought up in uh, you know, uh, a background which the stereotype goes right that would encourage pace and bounce and encourage you being a really strong player off the back foot. Now I think he is a back foot player, but he's actually a lot better driving on the offside and playing shots. I feel of his legs and so forth a lot better against the fuller ball. Um, so it's interesting. The South Africans could exploit this. They could do something like they did to Elgar in that series when he played. Now, obviously, Elgar was a lefty, and the techniques are different. But the idea is that I do feel that he has that vulnerability against the short ball, particularly down the leg side, to glove it and so forth. Um, but I think that's where somebody like a Corbin Bosch may come handy. The fact that he can bat well enough, I think, is another consideration for why they might be leaning towards it. With somebody like Mulder, I have seen that improvement in his bowling at the international level. He is very much the opposite, I would say, of somebody like a Corbin Bosch, in that he's a LBW candidate and a bold candidate. I was actually looking into the stats because I recall him struggling, especially earlier on in his career in the limited overs format, with a lot of balls that would just come in and basically trap him. LBW bold in Test match cricket. Now, granted, he's only played about 29 innings, but he's 10 of those innings he's been to LBW bold, right? And that's actually a fairly high percentage. At the international level, the top six test bats, you usually expect the number to be a little bit lower because there's usually a little bit better of a defensive technique to be able to keep out some of those deliveries. And admittedly, he doesn't bat very high up the order, but you know, there've been comparisons that have been made to him. You made the joke about how, like, on Twitter, the Garfield Sober stats are coming around, but the more obvious comparison that I've heard a lot of the times has been to Jack Cullis. And you know, he definitely, I mean, obviously different streets of quality of player at this level at this point in time, but he definitely does seem to be very vulnerable to that ball just nipping back in, or coming back in even through the swing and trapping him. Like Constas, he tends to play, uh, you know, around over his pad and so forth. Um, but but yeah, I think you know, Leon Mulder versus Corbin Bosch. It's tricky because Janssen is not exactly the best control bowler either, right? Like, he has his moments at this point, at this time of the game, because with his action, sometimes he struggles to, essentially with his non-bowling arm. I feel like he struggles to complete his action at times, and because he struggles to complete his action at times, it gets to the point where there's some days like that final match that they played, India and South Africa in the T20 World Cup, where he can be taken apart and pulled to the cleaners. Now, that is a T20, that is more likely to happen there, but even then, you're still looking at a situation where somebody's, he has some rhythm issues, right? It's kind of like Mitchell Stark, funny enough, where you can have some rhythm issues where his line and length might not quite line up, and then there's some days where everything sinks into place, or even Mitchell Johnson would be a better example, and he can absolutely just blitz through, right? Um, but I think that's where you look at that being a bit of a risk. Now with Bosch, I will say, and even Peterson, in that performance against South Africa, um, and when South Africa was playing Pakistan, I mean, um, when Bosch took his 4 wickets in that game, and then Peterson chipped in with his bunch as well. Rabada only took 1 wicket in that first innings where Pakistan collapsed. And I feel that when Pakistan collapsed in that particular situation, They really did so because of the pressure that was being exerted by Rabada on the other end. I remember that particular spell that he bowled. He bowled two spells, I believe, in that innings, and he beat he beat the bat consistently. I think that once in every six balls was a play and a miss, and he bowled a lot of overs relatively in those two spells. And he also, I think, had it where the like if control percentages can be iffy as I wouldn't trust them as the sole arbiter of determining whether a bowler has really bowled supremely well or not. But it was to the point where I remember like one in every three balls, the batsmen, the Pakistani batsmen were not in control of a shot they played to him, and they really reaped the rewards on the other end. Bosch in particular, because he was all over the place. Even that ball that he got Shan Masood with, which was his first wicket, was a wide ball. The length was okay, but it was very wide. Masood didn't have to drive it at all. It was like an eight stump or so forth. And there were just a couple of dismissals like that where they can count themselves the pressure exerted on the other end, I think really did tell. Um, so I think that's where that comes into effect. If you ask me about what the picks are from that end, my personal preference would be that I would lean towards picking Bosch over Mulder. Um, but Mulder does provide that extra bit of control that the South African attack on if Janssen's having an off day and so forth, it could come in handy. But I think Bosch does have just that little bit of extra batting talent that they may need, especially with the fragile batting lineup. With somebody like an Ngidi and so forth, with somebody like an Ngidi or so forth, you asked the question. I am concerned about his fitness. I do feel that with Ngidi, that there is a upside that I think he does have that ability to kind of naturally angle it in to the right hander. And I think if there is a fragility in this batting lineup, especially with that added pace, uh, I think you need to have that ability to be able to slant it in, especially if somebody like Constas is playing, or a couple of the others like Bo Webster and so forth are playing and so forth. And you need that good person who can be that third seamer and provide you that consistent heavy ball, which he can land in Ngidi. Um, so I do lean towards playing him. Um, but Dane Paterson, you mentioned Dane Paterson earlier. I do think he's had a respectable showing. I do think there's more to him than just being a late bloomer. He has had county stints in England, as a matter of fact. One where he took 52 wickets for, I think it was Glamorgan that he was playing with, for. Or it might have been not. I'm trying to recall, but he's had good performances, and yeah, he's not particularly quick. He bowls mid 120s, and yes, the opposition that he faced was not that great. But he did play a test in New Zealand where he did actually really well. He's very disciplined, very consistent, and that was an attack which he had to lead in the absence of the frontliners. Um, and not on the most friendliest bowling surface either. It must be said there was a lot of assistance actually for the spinner Dan Pete in that particular test. So I think somebody like Peterson comes handy in that regard. Um, I think I would give him a shot as well. Um, and I'd go with the five-man attack, as difficult as that might sound. I think the only question is that if the pitch is very seamer friendly, then I think you can leave Maharaj out. If you can't leave him out, then I think if it might actually be a better idea to have Peterson in just with the control that he provides, even over in Ngidi. If you're gonna not pick Mulder, if they do decide to go with Mulder though, then I'd probably pick Ngidi. So I think that should answer your question on that front. And yeah, I think from a selection standpoint, I think that would allow them to have bases essentially covered. The other thing with Dane Paterson is he actually got his claim to fame being a death bowler in limited overs format, and that's probably not going to factor as much into here. But he can bowl, decent Yorkers. It should be said, and I think the likewise with Corbin Bosch as well. So I think that's another factor that they can kind of take the pitch out of the equation if need be, if it becomes really slow and flat like we saw in Trent Bridge and so forth. But yeah, I think that covers your question. I think the other thing from my end, just looking at like a performance standpoint that I'm curious to see how it pans out is Bedingham, David Bedingham. He's very much an on the up batter. He's had a lot of success in county cricket. That was actually one of the reasons why he ended up getting selected. Um, but yep. He's had some struggles in recent times. The fuller ball troubles him a lot more. But he's very sort of very strong, powerful. Even in that India Test match, which was I think Elgar's last, 100 when Elgar scored that 185. He made a 50 and he was very comfortable against the short ball. So I think he's going to be a key figure if they want to do well against Australia, particularly against Hazelwood and Cummins. I think he's going to be the key man in the middle order. If he can get some runs, it's going to really shore up the batting lineup. Tristan Stubbs is probably going to play for them, but he starts out slow and he's still finding his way. Dezorzy, like you mentioned, and Rickleton. I think there's not really a debate there. I think both are going to play. Just because of the paucity of the options in the lineup. I know Mark Graham's there as well, but I think Dezorzi's probably owned. He's probably got a little bit of leeway given that 177 he scored against Bangladesh, and Rickleton I think is a very good talent who's going to end up playing for them for a long time. He keeps, so I don't think there's really a debate about him in the side. But yeah, I think that covers our main sort of conversation. Points really that we wanted to kind of bring up in over the course of just discussing this. Again, I appreciate Sanket, you taking out the time to chat and talk about all of this. You've already kind of alluded to your prediction earlier, right? That especially if it's a batter friendly surface, you probably going to lean towards Australia, and I think based off a discussion you mentioned that if you had to choose, Australia is probably going to get the best bet unless it's a green top. I tend to lean that way as well. I do think that the one exception to that rule is I know Lyon is a very good spinner, obviously, but I feel like if by happenstance we manage, and it's very unlikely, but we happen to get a pitch that turns a lot, I do think that you potentially could see Maharaj rip through this Australian lineup. I know he had a bad series last time around when he was in Australia, and there was a pitch there which David Warner scored a double hundred on a slow, relatively flat, but also a marginal amount of turn there as well, which he didn't do very well on. But if there's a turner, I could see potentially. You do have Kuhneman in the background, right? And if he gets picked, that I think he's better than Muthuswamy. But I could see on Turner that both sides misread. Maybe South Africa have the edge, but overall, I think Australia's going to come out as favorites. But yeah, so that was basically it from us today. For all of you listeners, we're glad you're tuning in and here to listen to our thoughts and so forth. Yeah, I mean, again, I wish Sanket best of luck. And an enjoyable, memorable experience. I hope he's going to be live at the ground, watching all of this. I hope he, has a wonderful time. And I hope he gets a really good game and his money's worth for the game that he's going to see and play, and watch being played, I should say. But yeah, that's it from our end. We'll sign off. Do remember to like, subscribe, do all the things that you do for the show. And thanks. Appreciate it. Bye.